Hi, my name is Layla. Diana. Very nice to meet you as well. Did you just start with the report? No. I'm the yeah. I don't know a lot about criminology. What's your area? What's your field? I'm doing PP. My area is philosophy. Okay. I'm mainly here. Ah.
Thanks, Scott. It's good to see so many of you here. It's Prof's first cultural criminology seminar of the term, and it's my great pleasure to welcome our visiting speaker from the University of Birmingham, Professor Dominique Moran. Dominique is Professor of Pastoral Geography, who works at the intersection between prison sociology, geography, and criminology. He has over the years been author or editor of books on pastoral geography, the historical geography of prisons and pastoral spaces, and was a couple of years ago now when you were at the Howard Journal's Best Article Prize for a paper on the prison military complex, which I think is the topic that is going to be returned to today. So it's a great pleasure to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed for coming along. I am frankly astonished at the number of students who are here at GD1. This is not what I am accustomed to. So I'm very, very pleased indeed to see you all. Thank you, and I hope I'm going to have something of interest to say to you. So thank you for that introduction, and thank you for the invitation. What I'm going to be speaking about this afternoon is something, a research topic that I've kind of been doing in the background with. So I normally work at the moment on the persistence of the Victorian estate in the UK. I'm interested in why and with what consequences we continue to operate prisons of that age, and also the influence of green space in the prison on well, I use stats and I use GIS and I use all sorts of things to investigate that question. But this topic about prisons and the military is something that's cropped up in all the research that I've done. So over a number of different prison projects, interviewing prisoners and staff over many years, a long time in all sorts of different places. same kind of thing has cropped up, and that's why I've sort of subtitled this prisons and the military, or I was in the army and then. Because that answer that kept coming up when I was talking to staff. So that's a bit easier. So there's another chair. What's it? So I am a little bit a human geographer trespassing into criminology, and I always have imposter syndrome, particularly when I'm full of people who know a lot more about this than me, so bear with. As I said, I've been doing research on cultural spaces, largely prisons. Started off doing research in Russia, gradually coming into the UK and Scandinavia, and all of the research that I do in prisons involves talking to the people who work there and who are incarcerated there and those who come to see them. So I'm always interviewing staff. I'm never interviewing them about their past. I'm always interviewing them about the spaces they work in, the work that they do, and so on and so on. But as you know, if you've done any interviewing, the first questions that you ask are always sort of to put the person at ease. You know, tell me about your role. How long have you been doing this? And I would so often hear, well, I was in the army, and then it came up a lot. But it was never something that I could pursue in that conversation. I was always going off to taking them in the direction that I was interested in. But it happens so often. So I started thinking, this is a thing. The number of former forces personnel who are in the prison service maybe is important. And how big a thing is this? And what other connections might there be between prisons and the military? How might I explore that? I tried to get a research grant to explore this. How much you know about how hard it is to get a research grant? It's hard, yeah. And I didn't get it. And the result of not having got it was that Ian got a submission of a paper to the Howard Journal, which is effectively putting the idea for that research grant out there so that somebody else could perhaps get cash and do that work. So there was perhaps a productive failure in this, but it made me think about what those connections might be and how we might take this question forward. And this has kind of extended, and I'm going to get to this at the end of the presentation, into, or rather from, quite a tight question about former military staff into a much bigger question. It kind of mushroomed, in a horrible, shaped way, really, into all sorts of bigger questions about the ways in which prisons and the military are connected, and particularly how war mediates that connection. So I hope that's what I'm going to get to in about half an hour's time, but we'll see. So this question, as Ian said, we took forward, myself, my colleagues, Jennifer Turner and Helen Arnold, with whom I was working at the time. We took this question forward into a paper which tried to think through what some of the connections between prisons and the military might be. And we came up with this sort of starter of a list. We talked about the senior leadership of the prison service by ex-forces personnel at the time. Rory Stewart was the prison's minister doing his thing about if he didn't clean up jails, he'd resign and so on. And he'd been for a short time in the armed forces, and of course has been really, really prominent and influential in people in the past. Alexander Patterson, who was in charge effectively of prisons in the late 1940s, was an ex-military person. I didn't know, but I learned that if the Prison Officers Association does the unthinkable thing and goes completely on strike, which I think they can't do, but if they did something as serious as that, the military would be brought in to guard prison walls. Maybe inside, but they'd be kind of guarding the perimeter. We all know that there are lots of military veterans in prison, and there's been stacks and stacks of research on that. The military has its own prisons for its own staff. Across the world, and particularly in Russia, where I started off, as I said, doing my research, military ranks are replicated in terms of how prison staff is organised, and quite often they wear uniforms which look just like to the sort of untutored eye of the military. There's lots of transfer of the built environment, technology and practices from one to the other and vice versa. And as we came to in the paper, there are lots of ex-forces personnel on the staff. So we were interested in how and with what implications the prison and the military were connected, and we looked at it first through this question of staff. So I'm going to talk about that for a bit and talk you through how we did a pretty shonky, really, bit of research on no money to try to answer this question. So just to be clear, I'm not talking here about veterans specifically. I'm not talking about former forces personnel who committed a crime and gone to jail. That's really important. There's lots of fantastic work on that, but that's not what we were focusing on. We were focusing on this question of ex-forces personnel on the staff, which I think is really well known about. I think criminologists who work in prison know there's loads of ex-forces personnel there. It's been widely observed, but as far as I could tell, having sort of combed through work on prison staff, and if you know of something that I missed, please say. Right? It's not really talked about, and we couldn't find research on it. I think it's a really topical question, though. Governments, particularly over the period through which we've been doing this research, have come back again and again to this. Let's get more ex-armed forces personnel into prisons. There's a staffing crisis. We also have a crisis of making sure that our former armed forces personnel have purposeful work after they leave the armed forces. So this is a kind of neat fix for those two questions. But how many are there? Why are they there? What difference they make? It was really hard to answer that question, to get an answer to it. And our first step was try to establish just how many of them there are, and it was much more difficult than I thought it would be. Worth saying, though, as a bit of context, that although we were looking at this in the contemporary period, it's by no means a new phenomenon. At the end of the 19th century, people were noticing how many ex-armed forces personnel there were. Lots of reports here at various times, people saying they're struck by just how many ex-soldiers there are on the staff. Somebody saying in 1914, practically all of the prison staff worked from the army or the armed forces. By the 1960s, people were saying that ex-forces personnel were still preferred recruits. By the 1980s, others were saying, well, 30 years afterwards, were saying that back in the 1980s, they were still the majority of prison officers. And it's likely, I think, that as the armed forces kind of waxes and wanes over periods of conflict, conscription and demobilisation and so on, that there are kind of outflows of armed forces personnel who perhaps go into the prison service in large numbers. But it's really hard to track that because there's no data since this time. So this is the only data we could really get, and you can see how old this is. Yeah. But if you look at the column on the right, I can't point at the screen, but the column on the right, ex-military percentage, that's really high actually across all those different types of jail. And the statistics at the bottom say essentially that if you were ex-armed forces, you were more likely to get hired than if you weren't. So there's something going on here, even back then. We know, in general, looking at contemporary research, that people who leave the armed forces tend to like going into hierarchical, security-oriented, uniformed, male-dominated workplaces. It feels familiar. There's a sense of camaraderie, which lots of people who leave the armed forces feel a lack of when they come out. And it's all those challenges that people who leave the armed forces have that some people say leads them into the offending behaviour that then makes them become veterans in custody. So there's a sense in which this is the sort of workplace, the prisoners arguably the sort of workplace that ex-forces personnel would generally be sort of led towards because it fulfills all those criteria of things which they feel familiar with. In the UK specifically, there are two other things which I think probably lead on ex-armed forces personnel towards prison work. One is that in the past, going back to the 1960s and a bit afterwards, and certainly prior to, prison staff used to live in accommodation that was next to the prison, and oftentimes it looked a bit like a barrack. So it was kind of individual terraced houses which were owned by the prison, and lots of single men lived in those. So they kind of lived on site almost, which is quite like being in the army when you would live on sort of army base. And you'd expect that you have to move around the prison service in order to get promoted, and that need to be movable also sort of replicates a bit the way that the armed forces work. There's also something about pensions, I mean, quite straightforward in that working in the British armed forces means that you're in Crown service and you have a particular sort of preferential pension. And if you, when you come out of the armed forces, continue in some line of work which is also considered Crown service, something good financially takes place. So you want to kind of stay there. if we can, and the prison service is that. So, coming to then this question that we started to answer, I'm not sure how well, but I'll do my best to talk through it. We didn't know how many of them there are in the prison service now. There's no systematic data kept on them. I spoke to the HR department of HMPS, so, is there such data? Can we share it? Can you share it with us if we strip all the information out? They're like, well, no, because there's nothing. We don't keep this information. Individual governors might know, but we don't know as a whole. So there's no way that we can track this. So the knowledge that we have already is based on sort of anecdotal observations. I'll sort of talk you through what those are a bit. But our own observations, just from those conversations and the sheer number of them that we had, I was in the army and then, indicates to us that there was something to be understood here. I guess I should backtrack a bit and go, well, why do we need to know how many ex-armed forces people there are? The reason is that because in the literature that we read, it was really clear that scholars looking at the prison service and commenting on the presence of ex-armed forces, prison staff, thought they weren't supposed to be there, considered them to be fundamentally unsuitable for the job. And this has gone back a really long time. So back in the 1890s, when, as you know from that table that you just saw, there were loads and loads of them doing this job. People were saying, although military warders are better for discipline, civilians have a higher moral character than soldiers. A large proportion of prison officers should therefore be civilians. They shouldn't be in this job. They aren't up to it. They aren't the right kind of person. By the 1960s, in the study, I think it's of Pentonville, isn't it? That 63 study. They're describing ex-military personnel as authoritarian, martinets who've merely exchanged khaki uniform for a blue one, saying that back in the 19th century, so when we just saw, they might have provided ideal material out of which to make a warder, in that the experience of handling men in the armed forces might have been a considerable advantage in a prison where so much of the activity consists of locking and unlocking, counting and recounting and telling prisoners what to do next. But given how reformed and rehabilitative and modern they felt the 1960s prison service was, they were no longer any good at this job. They couldn't deal with the complex human relationships which prison staff were now supposed to be able to cope with. So they weren't the right kind of staff. In the 2000s, we were saying the same thing, that soldiers, and it's always soldiers, it's never kind of potentially airmen or naval officers or whoever, soldiers are often too inflexible and discipline oriented to rise to the challenges of the modern prison officer role, and even a suggestion that punitiveness and hostility against prisoners could be coming out of the military backgrounds that some of these staff have had. It's quite serious things here. We're saying these are really not the right people who should be doing prison work. And I love this shot of his face. This is from when she was merely justice, before she ascended to the heights and then obviously what happened next. So this is her, not actually, she didn't dress like this, I hope, at the Conservative Party conference. But in 2016, she was saying quite a different thing. Perhaps quite a different thing. That ex-forces staff would bring the virtues of discipline. They would be a really key part in reforming the prison service, carrying forward the change that we want to see. They've got courage, they've got integrity, but definitely not of low moral character and unable to do this job. They are really good at this and they should be in there. So we've got two quite different perspectives, one from prison reformers and from researchers looking at the prison service, and one from policy makers, politicians talking about how the prison service should be. So we've got on the one hand it being argued that ex-forces personnel are not good at this job, but on the other hand we know they've been there in really large numbers and there's been active recruitment of them recently and I'm sure in the past. So why is this and with what consequences? So we wanted to know what difference this service made to prison officers' contributions in the role. Were they no good at the job or not? How has this changed over time if we could trace that, and what kind of prison staff culture ex-armed forces staff engendered? But first we had to answer this question, how many are there? So we did a survey online, which itself is suboptimal. And we had to go to the NRC, the National Research Council for Emergency is now. There's Majesty's Prisons and Probation Service, and they would only allow us to run it if it was emailed directly to staff's own inboxes at a specific number of prisons. They couldn't just do a sort of online survey. So the response rate is terrible. That's less than 5%. But that's kind of what you'd expect from a completely unsolicited survey coming from your boss on behalf of someone that you've never met that takes you time. Who would do that, right? We also ran it externally, not through NRC, for staff who are no longer employed by the prison service, over whom they have no control. So they can do what they want. It's the same survey, but the one for retired staff or staff who've left can sort of go back further in time. And that was why they did it, to kind of get back to the 60s and 70s for staff. So not great. Response rate, and we're therefore being quite careful about what we say on the back of those stats. In both surveys, we found that the majority of the people who answered it had military experience. We can't extrapolate from this though, because we think they were much more likely to fill out the survey if they could talk about their military experience. So we think it's self-selected in that way. A higher number of current rather than former staff declared this experience. The majority of those who said they'd had this experience had seen combat. It's quite interesting. So, key thing, there's a kind of headline stats, but we have to be really careful how we extrapolate from them. What we did do was ask people, rather than just take their own experience as representative, we asked them to tell us the percentage of their immediate colleagues at various points in their career who they knew had worked previously in the armed forces, to try to give a sense of how prevalent they felt this was. And for each person, we asked them at the time that they joined the prison service to think back to it, and either at the time that they were filling out the survey or at the time, thank you, that they left it, if they'd left already. So for each person, we got 2 data points, and we did this wrongly in bands. So if you do this yourself, don't do that. Ask them for a specific number, because it became really hard statistically to work with those bands, sort of 1 to 25%, 26 to 50. So students doing surveys, don't get it wrong. But what this meant was that for each person we had a kind of time point 1, time point 2, and so on, and we could use this to see, do we see a trend through time? And what we saw when we applied maths, and I didn't do maths, so I can't tell you how, but was that the military percentage had fallen through time. And my colleague drew this kind of scary graph, and that line of best fit goes through it. You can see she would have had a much easier time if we had actual numbers as opposed to these bands, but there we are. So it shows this general downward trend, and we sort of can estimate maybe that now it's about 1 in 4 who are ex-forces personnel compared to what it was like in the past. So it's downward, but it's still a lot. And that 1 in 4 figure, if that's even broadly correct, that's way more than the percentage of veterans in custody whose prevalence is used as the reason for the amount of research focus which is on them. They're a really large sort of employee group within the prison service, and they have lots of research done on them. But this quite high number, we think, of ex-forces staff isn't really thought about. So they think there's lots, and there's definitely been lots in the past. So what the difference does this experience make? Are they authoritarian, discipline, focus, and so on, or not? So just a bit of a backtrack a little bit. We noticed in reading some of the work on forces, ex-forces staff when they're mentioned, and we did this, through word searches for military, militaristic, whatever we could find. We sort of found that people doing research on prisons tended to have quite a negative perception of what they considered militaristic prisons. It became a shorthand almost for austere environments, impersonal interactions, authoritarian drill, and unrelenting discipline. It's definitely a bad thing. If you called a prison militaristic, you didn't like it. Something was wrong with it. And there seemed to be a bit of a trade-off between calling a prison militaristic, or saying that the way that it's being managed has these tendencies, and a trade-off between that and a sense in which the prison officers doing the job can show empathy, can be sympathetic, can have sort of soft skills. If a prison's militaristic, they're just locking people up, unlocking them, marching them around, and so on. And there's mentions of this. There's staff subculture of militarism being linked to the Strangeways riots or staff reactions during them. Militaristic paraphernalia is argued precipitating prison violence, which I think is quite the leap, but that claim is made. And the sense in which the prison officer brutality that Sims talking about in the 1970s and 80s is somehow symptomatic of a militarisation of the prison service. What's never explicitly said is whether this militarisation is linked to actual former military service on the part of the staff, or if it's something else, or indeed what that something else is. So I thought that was just interesting to note. So in looking at this next, and in going through the free text responses that we had on our survey, we were looking at prison staff culture and trying to understand kind of how might we think about these ex-forces personnel. And we used here as our way in Crew and Liebling's work on prison staff and the ways in which there's a sense in which sort of in Crew's work he's talking against what he described as an enduring view among critical penal scholars that power and its application is always dangerous and objectionable. So he's arguing that there needs to be the use of power, but it has to be done in the right way. Liebling previously had talked about traditional prison officer culture, which she described as being something of a them and us, where traditional prison officers have both negative attitudes towards the prisoners they're taking care of and their own senior management, and they're obsessed with security and safety. And Crew and his colleagues divided that group into two types. What they called traditional resistant, who they characterised as cynical, petty, disrespectful, and preoccupied with control, and traditional professional, who they described as confident, boundaried, clear, vigilant, and knowledgeable. And they argued that although a traditional culture might not have kind of softness and empathy to it, it can still be safe and it can be fair, and prisoners can actually like it because they feel safe and they feel as if they'll be fairly treated in it. So Crew is saying there needs to be enough clear and consistent authority shown by prison officers who are self-assured and confident as a kind of almost sort of optimal way of doing things. I'm simplifying enormously for speed, but that's sort of broadly where we come to. So we used this model to look at what we were hearing about prison staff who had forces backgrounds and what kind of skills they had. What became really clear is that military experience is not one thing. Just having been a good infantry engineer or combat medic doesn't make you a good prison officer. And the code on all these, as I'm sure that you guessed, is gender, age, military or not. We're saying that this survey was open to both people with this experience and not. We're interested to see what views people who didn't have military experience had of their colleagues who did. And there's lots of emphasis on the need for flexibility, being able to adapt and change in this role. And just because one ex-forces member of staff is good at it, doesn't mean that they all are. There was definitely a strong flavour of this traditional resistant model. Absolutely stuff that was indicating that cynical, petty, disrespectful and control obsessed. You can read, so I'll let you read those yourself. But you can see this sort of sense of senior management don't know what they're doing. We need to put the right sort of people in place, and they are ex-forces. They'll sort all this out. You know, stuff's going on, shouldn't be. We need to get in charge of these jails and start doing things right. There's discipline and so on and so on. And lots of those kind of comments were coming through from people who had a military background and who were, but not always, quite old. So they've been in the prison service quite some time, but not always. However, there was also a lot of indication of that confident, boundary, clear, vigilant, and knowledgeable. And they lots of talk about good role models, having authority, being consistent, and so on, setting standards and kind of setting the path. And this kind of comment came up all the time. They don't panic. When prisoners kick off, ex-armed forces staff are calm and they deal with it. They don't panic. This notion of military or empathetic we were quite interested in. Did it mean if you were ex-forces that you couldn't show compassion? The opposite seemed true. This person talking about not only have they got these kind of skills, they've got good prior training and so on, They can do the CNR stuff, but they're also able to show compassion, particularly at times of bereavement. They understand the importance to prisoners of going to funerals. This is something which matters a lot, and perhaps there are reasons why that might be. Something really interesting came up around life experience. It came up in relation to this traditional professional characteristic. They have the life experience and outlook to change offenders. They've got something about them which is useful, contrasted with younger people who are joining the prison service. And this kind of comment we hear a lot. Prison service is recruiting really young people who don't have the confidence, they haven't got the kind of courage and so on to do this job well, whereas ex-armed forces personnel have got it. And prisoners can sometimes take the piss and so on, and ex-armed forces people know how to deal with this. Question about what kind of life experience this is. Are they just older? Is that all? Or is it because they've obviously served time in the armed forces first, so they're coming to the prison service having had some working experience, or is it military experience? And this person who completed the survey, who's actually the governor, talking about there being an overrepresentation of ex-military staff in his good and very good operational staff, but whether they were good anyway before they went into the armed forces, or if it was armed forces experience that made them good. I can't say, and indeed, sort of extremely good question. What we do know from military civilian transition research is that ex-military personnel arguably actually lack so-called life experience. Having been institutionalised, having been absent from family life, having had an intense socialisation in the armed forces, they actually find it quite hard, quite often, to cope with running their own life without that structure, without the discipline which comes from the armed forces. And arguably that's why they end up, some of them, committing crime and becoming veterans in custody, because that's hard to cope with. So this question really about whether the military experience they have is better at helping people in prison cope with the life they have in prison, and this arguably sort of similar to the military environment, institutional, discipline, structured, and so on, than it is in preparing people for life after custody, when they're going to find that sort of chaotic life that they have to run themselves. We question whether the prison becomes a kind of halfway house for staff between the military and civilian life, in the same way that other uniformed employment does. Do they ever leave the armed forces if they go into this environment? But is there, on the other hand, any similarity between navigating that military-civilian transition for them and helping people who are going to have to navigate a prison civilian transition, in understanding, the kind of challenges they'll have? Ex-forces respondents seem very much less likely than service leavers generally to have left the armed forces. So they stuck out their commission period right to the end, generally, rather than leaving early for some other reason. This might indicate that they have a high level of commitment to their organisation, that they can deal with stress, and that they can sort of stick with employment when it gets hard. We're extrapolating, we're guessing here. But if that's the case, if they're more stickable, if you like, in work, that makes them really attractive to the prison service, because as I'm sure that you know, attrition is a massive problem. People coming in, working for a short time and going again. Most of the people that we surveyed have spent a lot of time out of full-time employment between leaving the armed forces and taking up prison work. On average, more than 4 years of that, so doing odd jobs and so on. Most of them hadn't even thought about prison work. Only 1 in 5 of them had actually targeted the prison service as an employer that they might work for. They'd all wanted to be in the police, the fire service, the border force, something else rather than prison. So they drifted into this, attracted by those things I was talking about earlier, robust and reliable pension, this continuation of Crown service, and so on. So once they were in, we looked at as much as we could at how they progressed through the ranks in the prison service. They were just as likely as people who didn't have ex-forces experience to be in senior positions, despite having come in with less educational qualifications. So there might be something going on there in terms of what the military does for them. I just want to finish this bit by giving you a bit of insight into what the prison service are doing right now. So they've got an advance into justice program now, which is taking people directly from armed forces service. When they're a year prior to leaving, they can sign up They can have a fast track interview. They can be sort of supported through the whole application process. And if they get a job offer, it's held open for them for 12 months so that they aren't stressed kind of coming to the end of their service. They get a lot of assistance with relocation expenses, and they say, as you would imagine, that it's great. It's really, really great. It kind of smooths that transition, takes away all the anxiety, can cope with what they might do next, and so on. And it offers the prison service a way to kind of fast track people into the prison service. Now, I'm not sure what I think about this, given what we know already. Like taking people directly from the armed forces, it might be kind of saving them wasting those 4 years kind of drifting about, or it might be meaning that they come in with even less ability perhaps to talk people through what the civilian transition is. But there we are. There's been a lot of ex-military personnel, therefore, in the prison service. I think it's unavoidable that over the period of time they've been there, they'll have influenced it somehow. We know that the prior experience people have had in their prior job influences how they do their next job, although it's really research. We know that former military personnel, they go into banking, for example, tend to operate in a much more moral manner, perhaps, than the average banker. We know that if they go into teaching, they tend to stick at that when most people might leave. We know that they have these characteristics when they go into their next job. So they bring something to the prison service, and the sheer number of them over all that time must have had an influence, right? The prison service must have been shaped by them to an extent, but we don't really know how much influence they've had. There's this trope of militarism, which is talked about in the literature around it. And I think there's a question about, how are people understanding this term? What understanding do the researchers who look at prisons and call them militaristic, what do they actually know about what the military is like and how it runs? And how are they applying those stereotypes? And of course, there's lots of questions which we can get in this research on how ex-forces personnel engage with veterans in custody. We've got flavours of this. For example, veterans in custody sometimes feel quite embarrassed working with ex-armed forces staff, given that they've kind of gone down the wrong path, whereas they're looking at someone who's had the same experience and who's not. On the other hand, there can be a lot of shared experience and some positive relationships there. This quote, I think, sums it up quite well. Quite a long time ago, 100 years of constant complaints from reformative groups has made no real impact on the presence of ex-servicemen on prison staff. The assumption that their treatment of prisoners is likely to be more severe than that of any comparable working class group. You can see it's an assertion based on a distaste for militarism, which is widely felt by reformative groups and so in other words, kind of sniffily saying you academics have the wrong idea about what this is all about. There's the answer to that. Really quickly, because we've not got lots of time, and I know that I'm talking a lot and it's warm. I wanted to give you a quick sense, as fast as I can, of some of the other things that we started to investigate around these connections. And the one we've kind of done to an extent is that last one. The one we started to focus on next was this transfer of the built environment. Now, I'm a geography instead, so I'm really interested in places and built environment and its influence on people and things and so on. So maybe I look at prisons in a slightly different way to the way that criminologists do. I'm much more about the building, really, and then the people, the opposite way around. In lockdown, I went down a wormhole about HMP Rolleston, which was an army base on Salisbury Plain that in the 1980s became a prison for a short time, and then went back to being an army base again, and then went to being a prison again. And it was done in response to overcrowding of the prison system and POA industrial action. The government essentially needed to find someone to put prisoners who were sat in police cells, find somewhere to stick them. Army bases, obvious. Let's use that. So they introduced this Temporary Prisons Act, which then made army bases prisons and made anyone who worked in them a prison officer. Quite a thing. It's quite an incredible thing, to have done. And this operated for a short time, went back and forth again, and now it's an army base. I just got interested in, when does a prison stop being one? When does a military base become a prison? And why don't we know about this? Why has it happened a lot? Is this the only case it's ever happened, or or what? What kind of transfer has there been? And on the back of that, we wrote this paper, Gemini, about sort of trying to do a categorization almost of how prisons and use war as a sort of useful moment or a useful process, if you want, to sort of catalyze some of these transitions. Trying to think about the ways in which prisons and the military intersected through or after war. And we came up with this sort of 5-point typology. And this is quite listy, so I'll go through it quick, otherwise it can get dull. But we started off with what happens to pre-existing prisons during war. One option is that they can kind of continue as they were, albeit with limited staff, and that's kind of what happened quite often in the UK. This is a really famous picture of HMP Liverpool Walton Jail, where I was at earlier this year for 3 weeks. That's K-Wing, they fixed it now. Pretty pleased to hear. But you can still see on the wall a big scar, all brickwork. You know, I love all this. The painted brick, you can see the joints. But that got bombed during the Second World War. So they kind of carry on and kind of make do with what's happening. They can get requisitioned by the armed forces, essentially transferred to the MOD. And this happened a lot. So here's just some examples of what happened to individual prisons passed between the military and the prison service. So actually talking about a military prison, not just Wollaston, arguably all of these have had that in the past. I won't go through all of them, but they also serve as strongholds in urban conflict. Two really famous examples there. One from what seems to me still news, but you guys were at school when this took place. You know, prisons are big, robust strongholds of buildings. They're fantastic for camping out in urban conflict. They're great at that, and that's what happens to them quite a lot. Also, as I'm sure that you also know, sources of potential conscripts, which is going on as we speak. So there's all sorts of curious and quite scary stuff which happens to prisons during war. We've also then got prisons which are created by the military in war. And I'm using prison in a really broad sense here. You'll have noticed on that paper we talked about the castle, which castle geography is kind of much bigger than just prisons, but bear with me for now. So this happens when the military creates spaces to imprison, either because that's what it's doing, kind of by the by, or because in the case of concentration camps, they're seeking to control, immobilize, and then kill a particular group of people. So we get internment sites. Here's one on the Isle of Man that I didn't know had ever taken place. You know? Perhaps I'm just a terrible story, and you guys know this, but I didn't know that these things happened, at least at this scale. POW camps, concentration camps, and so on. And many of these have afterlives afterwards, after the war. They end up being something else. Indeed, I think there's a refugee assembly centre outside Berlin that was concentration camp. Yeah. So these sites sort of futures in the pastoral system as well. The military prison at Colchester was a POW camp towards the end of the Second World War, and it also had this curious period when it was part of the prison system. It had, I think it's for the first time, as we see that I could find, a prison that was actively managed both by the military and the prison service when those military personnel were still in the some sort of weird hybrid. New Labour got rid of that as soon as they came in, but it was going in '97. Then we've got prisons which are enabled by war. Prisons which come into being after war, using the infrastructure that war has left behind. The most obvious of these is where there's transfer of defunct military infrastructure, stuff the military has built for the purposes of war that ends up becoming a prison. And here's two examples, which were internment camps, held Rudolph Press, I think. It opened as a Borstal, then as a prison for men, and now it's got foreign national offenders in it, I think, and High Point is an example as well. Masses of these constructions of prisons on cleared RAF bases, loads and loads and loads of them. Also lots and lots of prisons which are built on MOD land, and that makes sense, right? Prisons are expensive to build. You need a big patch of land. If you have to buy that land, it costs the earth. So much cheaper to use land that the government already owns, MOD. Perfect. So you have this sort of nice exchange. So there's nothing left of these sites generally. They just build something new on them. What I find really interesting is when the prison actually inhabits the buildings that are a military base. takes them over and it runs them. I'm sure everyone's thinking, the co-cyclist says the barracks, the prison, and so here we are. It takes lots and lots and lots of these, many, many more than I've put there on the slide. At least 27 prisons in England and Wales were a military base first. Geography I am, so I have for you almost a map. This is an aerial photograph from 1946 of RAF Colters Hall in Norfolk. Apologies for the graininess, atmospheric. You see how it's been kind of spliced there. These are the aircraft hangars. These are H blocks. This is accommodation for the RAF. H block we think of as being a classic prison shape, yeah? Northern Ireland, the H block campaign, yeah? So it's military, actually. So this is accommodation for the RAF. This is HMP Bure. That's what it is now. The parade ground is the football pitch. They put a wall around it, but it's the same. They use the buildings that they used to use back then. And of course, added stuff and so on. But it's the same fabric. And indeed, this happened fairly recently. And when it happened, the governor coming into it said, it's great this. These are really solid buildings. They were built to withstand the Luftwaffe. Prisoners can't knock them down. Perfect for this. Really, really, it's great. Apologies having to flip this around. It's just to make it look like what you've just seen. Same thing here at Lindholm, which proudly says that it was RAF. As well, and here, English Heritage, whose job it is to kind of trace what happens to old buildings, talks about the fact that the buildings have only been altered in limited ways to make them secure, and so on. And they're still thrilled with this, patches of camouflage paint. And I went, oh, patches of camouflage paint still on these buildings, amazing. But this stuff is kind of still there. These traces are still there. HMS Ceres, a naval land base, became HMP YOI Weatherby, and it's the only prison now with an army Air Force in it. And in 2020, that big military celebration that we had during COVID, they were doing all sorts of bake-offs and quizzes and stuff which recall the military history of the site. There's all sorts of interesting layered kind of connections here. It's more than just the buildings being a military base. So that H block that we think of as being a classic prison thing turns out at least to have its roots in a military built form. It's not about just what these prisons are, we were in the past, it's also where they are. So these military based conversions obviously create prisons where they are, where these bases are. And if you think a little bit about the World War II and what we had to do in it, we needed to build a stack of RAF bases on large flat expanses of land near to the North Sea. So that's where these prisons end up being converted in, right? Rather than thinking after the war and that period of privation when we hadn't got billions of cash to throw around to build new prisons, we had to use what there was. Rather than applying a logic of where might we need prisons, we put them where we could. We converted bases, and as Ian has pointed out already in his work, we end up with arguably an inappropriate distribution of prisons in the UK because the carceral geography of prisons in the UK is partly a military one. Because there was an RAF base, not because that's where we needed it. I'll race through this because time's got away from me. There's also prisons that are influenced by the aftermath of war. So after the Second World War, prisons were in a complete state in Western Europe, and not only in the UK but also in France. That was the occasion for a really big reform movement. The state that prisons were in meant that the people who'd been complaining for a long time that prisons were terrible finally got their way and things changed. In England, the experience of incarcerating conscientious objectors in the First World War meant that those people who were arguably more articulate, literate, confident in expressing their opinions did so in public in various different ways and made people aware of the state of prisons. And arguably that precipitated a whole pile of reform to the prison service at that earlier point. The 1948 Universal Declaration on Human Rights was a response to the Second World War, and it in turn influenced the 1948 Criminal Justice Act and the 1955 UN Standard Minimum Rules for the Treatment of Prisoners, which are and still are important documents. So this sort of post-conflict prison reform story is quite well established in Western Europe. The opposite, unfortunately, happens in post-conflict global South now. Prisons tend to get neglected in post-conflict reconstruction. International donors are very happy to fund the police and the courts, but they don't want to go anywhere near prisons in case they end up basically funding torture.
The fifth type, prisons on a much more nebulous military influence, sort of brings us back to where we started. So here, we argued that, you know, this sort of RAF to HMP transition, take this base and make it a jail, probably nowhere near as straightforward as that, but no one has ever traced one. No one's really studied it. What takes place? Is there a military overhang? Are there transferred personnel? What happens? How does this prison sort of start off, and to what extent does the military influence it? We know that even outside of what we consider a sort of straightforwardly post-military estate, those places which have directly been transferred from one thing to the other, there's a military history in almost all of our prisons, especially the ones which have been there since the which were already there in the First and Second World Wars. And we've got a really large number of people in a post-military phase of their life on either side of the door, living out their lives in those spaces. We see what we sort of describe as post-military landscapes inside prisons. If you've ever been on a Veterans in Custody, they've really often got paintings of helicopters on the wall, and emblems of the military there, and even quite modern prisons have got plaques really often commemorating, you see at top right, just like lots of employers do and so on. So there's all sorts of military memorialisation going on, and then in a much more nebulous way, there are more subtle connections between prisons and the military through war. So conscientious objectors, being incarcerated during the First and Second World Wars are there because there's a war on and they don't want to fight in it. We've had special judicial powers during the war on terror, which have meant that lots of people have been incarcerated because of that other less tangible conflict that's going on, but they're being incarcerated in ordinary prisons, so they're arguably kind of bringing the prison service into articulation with that different kind of conflict. So to sum up then, there's an awful lot going on here, and I don't pretend that I've got to the bottom of it or kind of untangled it. Perhaps I've tangled it up more. But this code statement that prisons resemble factories, schools, barracks, hospitals, which all resemble prisons, and obviously that's my not his. There's a lot in this, but the forms of resemblance, I think, are really unexplored. We've tried to sort of map it out a bit, but I think there's masses more. If anyone's interested in a PhD topic, you can take masses here. We tried to talk about this a bit in this post-military complex, trying to describe how big this is and the web of connections there are that kind of layer on top of each other in all sorts of interesting ways. And this military carceral connection, I think, started calling extends after conflict. Last two slides now. Like any good stroke bad academic, if you try to answer one question, you answer it with a slight more questions, and it comes out at things like this. You know, does something of the military adhere to the prison through those experiences of back and forth and overlaying different shifts and vice versa? How far does the military rely upon carceral practices, or the prison rely upon military forms of management, whatever those might be? And I think we need to understand those better. I've certainly got a little bit into critical military scholarship, and it's way more complicated than I ever thought. There's a role of war in developing carceral institutions, and the carceral is absolutely implicated and leveraged by the military in conflict. So I think there's a big question about what the co-presence of the military and the carceral means. So from kind of, I was in the army there and then, there comes a lot of other things. Once you lift up the stone, you know, and you see what's beneath it, and then you start to dig. You know, lots and lots of things come from it. Where I think this is important, this question, is because of, and here I'm sort of talking in a much broader sense about political geography and the way in which geographers think about spaces of confinement writ large, rather than prisons specifically, and the way in which they use the terminology of the carceral in a much broader sense. They tend to overlay, and think about, rather, if you overlay the military over the carceral, it kind of heightens them both. And when you do this, you get arguably states and spaces of exception after Agamben, right? My husband talks about
this
in the
in
one
the work that he does on the military pastoral features of Olympic security, particularly the Sochi Winter Games and all kinds of exceptional strategies were put in place to enable that games to take place, and there was all sorts of pastoral practices as well. And of course, as we all know,
in
in
Scotland,
both Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib, there's definitely a sense in which this co-presence of a military force in war, in pastoral
setting
all most means that all bets are off. The military license enables you to almost do what you want to, whatever that is in that context. So I think there are broader questions which this touches upon, but I can't possibly answer here
about
about the relationship between the military, the pastoral, and the civilian.
you've also
Away from really thrilled.
thank you.
Thank you. Having raised those questions, there's a reasonable chance that someone will ask you to try and answer them, but we go on. So, we've some time left, and my phone refunctions, I don't know how much. The floor is open for questions, comments, observations. There's a hand at the back.
So I missed the very start of this, and sorry. So you may have actually answered this, but I'm not fully clear on the broad definition of pastoral. But when you were talking about sort of